Welcome to the Stetzer ChurchLeaders Podcast. Conversations with today's top ministry leaders to help you lead better every day. And now, here are your hosts, Ed Stetzer and Daniel Yang.
Welcome to the Stetzer ChurchLeaders Podcast, where we're helping Christian leaders navigate and lead through the cultural issues of today. My name's Daniel Yang, National Director of Churches of Welcome at World Relief, and today we're talking with Dr. Chris Adams. Chris is a professor, chaplain, and executive director of the Mental Health and the Church Initiative at Rosemead Graduate School of Psychology at Biola University. He's also executive director of the Flourishing in Ministry Project, which puts the spotlight on the well-being of clergy and their loved ones. If you enjoy our interviews, be sure to follow and like us on Apple Podcasts. Now let's go to Ed Stetzer, editor-in-chief of Outreach Magazine and the dean of the Talbot School of Theology.
So, Chris, at the time of this recording, we just had breakfast a couple days ago,
Yes, we did.
And I was super fascinated by some of the questions from this leader from the Global South.
Yes,
and honor shame culture, but just seeing the need for how Christians can step into this mental health space in a place where, in this country, that's just not something that people talk about. But Christians know the world is broken. Nobody gets through an unbroken world without some brokenness.
Yes.
And so then we think about where mental health fits in. So this is, you're leading this project here, this really significant project called Flourishing in Ministry. It's flourishinginministry.org for people who are interested. So there is a bit of a sense where some people would say, well, just if you go to a doctor, to get your blood pressure checked, just don't put any, you can go to a doctor who's an atheist or another religion.
Right.
So is there a Christian view of mental health that's different than a secular view of mental health? And if so, why does that matter?
Yeah, I certainly would hope so. In fact, the American Psychiatric Association just recently came out with a study that it was over 70% of people in North America go to a faith leader first for mental health kinds of concerns. And so for church people, we know that they trust their pastor and they're going to go to them first. And that's a wonderful thing because pastors have the credibility and the trust. And so these are certainly issues that are coming up all the time in congregations and churches. In the Global South, they don't have the resources and mental health delivery system like we do here in the U.S. But our hope at a place like Rosemead School of Psychology is that we're integrating psychology in a theologically directed way. In other words, we start with a theological worldview and assumptions and are critically thinking about psychological theories. We don't adopt any of them wholesale, of course, and really think about what's helpful to help us understand what it means to be human, what's consistent with biblical truth and theological assumptions and what isn't, and how do we help people live into holiness and wholeness in a way that is fundamentally a part of their Christian discipleship.
Yeah, and it's probably weird to people, but I got to take 10 seconds to explain. At a university, there are different schools. I lead the Talbot School of Theology at Biola University. Chris is in the Rosemead School of Psychology. It's very well respected. My daughter's a psychology major in their program, going to Biola, and I read a thing recently. It's one of the top psychology programs in the country. But it's a little weird, why is the School of Psychology doing a flourishing in ministry coaching?
Sure.
Well, one of the things that's really great about Biola is everybody is ultimately deeply integrated a biblical worldview and very driven by serving the church. So they have this flourishing in ministry opportunity, this coaching, all that sort of stuff. I'll talk more about that a little bit later on. But just to give a little context, it might be a little strange to people. So I'm going to be asking all these pastor questions to you because our audience is pastors and church leaders. You've already mentioned, I've often said that in a mental health crisis, pastors and police officers are almost always one of the two first responders, depending on how severe the crisis is, and often have very little training in what to do.
Correct.
So when we think, we're going to talk some about their own mental health in this, and we'll kind of walk through that as well. But what is it? What's the challenge of walking through when the pastor is that caregiver? What's some early advice when that pastor or church leader, he or she gets somebody calls up, says, I'm in a crisis. What do I do? What's your advice? Yeah,
absolutely. Well, and you're absolutely right. Pastors are first responders. They don't often get included in that group of folks. And I always like to say to pastors, I don't think they get nearly enough credit for the preventative mental health work that they're doing just by doing what they do and having a congregation in which people participate. They're doing an enormous amount of preventative mental health work that keeps people from getting into crisis in the first place. But in those crises, I think the important thing is to remember your scope of practice, if you will. So to not try to enter into treatment of particularly severe, complex mental health issues when that's not your training. On the other hand, to not underestimate the importance of your role as a shepherd, as a caregiver, even when people do need specialized mental health treatment or even psychiatric hospitalization. The pastors still have a very important role that nobody else can fill in the lives of people, as really nobody else is relating to the whole person the way that pastors do. We need other helping professions. They're certainly important and helpful, but nobody else is engaged in all of life from birth to death, and at birthday parties and funerals and worship services and picnics and Little League games and everything else, the way pastors are. No other helping professional has access to people's lives in that way. So to kind of find that balance between not trying to do more than you're qualified to do, but at the same time not abdicating the importance of the role that you have in people's lives, even when we are referring them and collaborating with other specialists of various kinds.
Yeah, and I want to press in a little bit on that, because I want to say that as someone who deeply values and has valued the work of Christian, therapy opportunities, counselors, counseling, and more, sometimes you give us a little bit of a mixed message.
Uh-huh.
And so I recently had Jim and Heather Sells on the podcast. We'll link to
great.
it.
Yeah,
talking about Beyond the Clinical Hour. And
yes,
part of their thing is, I think, a pushback to some of the idea that what we kind of maybe heard, I don't know, I've been a pastor since 1988, and what I first heard is, pastors, you need to refer more. And so we referred more. And I will tell you that in some ways, as a pastor, I mean, walking with people through difficult seasons is a hard, time-consuming thing. And so we got to get out of that business, and we got to partner with the professionals. So we did that. And then there's sort of the message now, like Beyond the Clinical Hour, part of our conversation here is, no, we actually need to be more than just referrers. The Bible tells us to carry one another's burdens. And so I think most pastors want their church to be a friendly church. Okay, that's great. Maybe they want their church to be a caring church. That's good too.
Absolutely.
But to be a carrying church where we bear one another's burdens is a different level. So I don't want to, I get concerned about the pendulum swing that I've seen just in my 30 years in ministry. That's there. So where is that right spot where, okay, so you said complex issues, right? So, but how do I know when something's a spiritual struggle versus a mental illness? What did you call it? My scope of
practice.
Scope of practice. I'm not an expert to spot that. I mean, I can spot certain things, right? We can all sometimes see what we might have called bipolar disorder looks like. We've all seen different expressions of that. But sometimes we just don't know. And so we should get more training. And that's why we have places like Talbot School of Theology and Rosemead and lots of our other wonderful partners out there. So you hear my concern, maybe even my frustration. So how do we do that well?
Yeah. And I share your concern too, Ed. I'm ordained and have been in pastoral roles and university chaplaincy roles as well. And share that concern in part because not all therapists are created equal, and so we need to use discernment in terms of who we refer to, and having some kind of relationship, which is challenging given all the demands on the time of pastors. But knowing the folks you're referring to and knowing their own theological competencies and so forth can be really helpful in being able to trust that referral. But it really is a both and, in my experience, that we don't want to refer and then the pastor's out. Because again, when the church is at its best, it's inherently therapeutic. It's more than that. But when a church is at its best and someone's involved in a church, that does things in people's lives that I'm not sure even the best of therapists can do on their own with just therapy. We really need the life and community. And that's certainly been underscored during and after the pandemic, that what people need is connection and belonging, and the church provides that, and provides an opportunity for people to learn the practices that research is quote unquote discovering help human beings to flourish. And many, if not most of those, are actually ancient Christian spiritual practices. So they're not really new to the Christian faith. They've been a part of the church for centuries.
Yep. And I think the kind of balance, pastors as helper, it's a helping profession. and it's a broken world. And
Yes.
again, a church without broken people is a broken church. I mean, that's not everyone has to be shiny and happy, but a church without broken people is a broken
Right.
church. We need that.
Yes.
But I think in some ways it gave pastors. I mean, I don't want to say this in the sense that there was some bad motive, but it did give them an opportunity to just say, hey, let's let me not worry about this. You take care of this. And then, but we need a community of care that includes pastors, key leaders in the church, and mental health professionals where appropriate. And I would say best done with Christian mental health professionals as well, who share a common worldview. So I guess then a big part of what you're doing in this initiative, it's flourishing in ministry. Now what you hear that, like, right? It's like, so it's not directly aimed at those individual church members, though it has a relationship. We'll get to that, but is for ministry leaders, for pastors and church leaders.
Yes.
So if you don't mind, tell us a little bit. I mean, again, because of the part of it is the helping profession, you feel that as well. So what about the well-being of church leaders? How did that get your concern? And then tell us about the research. Just walk with us through where flourishing in ministry comes from.
Right. And one concept, by the way, I'll just mention that I encourage pastors to think about is helping to create a web of care around a given person.
Oh, I like that web of care.
That includes them. And they're in a unique position to sort of help facilitate that web and may include physician, therapist, psychiatrist, social worker, but also includes Sunday school teacher, choir director, women's ministry director, and that whole web working together over time is what is enormously redemptive and healing for people. And so we're also thinking about a web of care for ministry leaders themselves. Yeah. I'm a third generation pastor's kid. So my grandfather was a pastor of mostly in his career what I like to call small clergy killing New England congregations.
Ouch. Yes.
And lots of stories from those eras. He's one of my heroes. He died young of a heart attack. And I'm convinced that a lot of that had to do with the amount of stress. He did everything. He mowed the church lawn. He made the church bulletins on a mimeograph machine back in the day, preached to the pastoral care, did it all. And nobody was really talking about, the stress of ministry back in those days. And then my dad, I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee, where God lives, as you know, Ed is in Nashville. My dad was in music ministry his whole career. So because of that, I was just in hundreds and hundreds of pastors' homes all my life across a lot of different denominations, and saw a lot of amazing examples of different philosophies of ministry and ecclesiologies and stuff, but also saw a lot of common pain. And then got into my own seminary years and theology degrees and started working in a local church and had my own experiences of ministry stress. And the path the Lord had for me was to become a psychologist specializing in working with ministry leaders and their families, given the unique joys there. There is no greater joy, in my opinion, than being in ministry and being a pastor. And there are also very unique stresses that are often hidden, even from ministry leaders themselves. And then the impact of the stresses is off the radar until it hits a threshold of severity. And then it can really catch people unaware and in a very painful way. And so we've been trying to think about how do we study what's right with healthy leaders? What are the factors and conditions and practices that are promoting that well-being, even in the midst of all of the complexity and stress and strain that are just inherent in ministry leadership? And yet, how do we live into the abundant life Jesus talks about? And how do we do that with a sense of joy? Doesn't mean we're minimizing or denying the enormous challenges. It's just a really, really tough job. Always has been, maybe more so, at least in North America right now, than it has been in recent decades, in my experience. And yet there are, as you know, so many incredibly faithful people out there doing amazing, fruitful work day in and day out. And we want to just help them sustain that. How do we do that for as long as possible, as effectively as possible?
Yeah. And so what did some of the research show you?
Yeah. So the challenge is sustaining daily well-being is probably one of the biggest challenges. So our flourishing in ministry model has 5 dimensions to it: daily well-being, resilience, thriving, authenticity, and then the health of the social ecosystem that a pastor is living in. And the first thing to get low for ministry leaders is daily well-being. So just that sense of doing pretty good physically, in your physical health, your emotional health, relationally, spiritually, vocationally, not necessarily the best day you've ever had, but just pretty good. And if that gets too low for too long, it can start to pull down all the other dimensions of flourishing as well. And so we often start with really basic things: getting enough sleep, getting enough exercise, appropriate nutrition, et cetera, which aren't, in a sense, aren't rocket science. I mean, most of us know what we should be doing more of to take better care of ourselves. But the things that get in the way, the obstacles to doing those things for pastors can be very complicated. And so we often spend a lot of time talking about the obstacles, what's getting in the way, and how do we help people set goals. And the good news and what we're finding is that small steps done frequently and consistently really do accumulate positively over time and make a difference. So for example, just 5 minutes of silence in the middle of the day, where you don't even have to pray. You can meditate, think about an attribute of God or a passage of scripture, a worship song that you love, and just do that for 5 minutes a day. It's not going to erase the bad day, of course. It's really stressful when 10 things popped up at church unexpectedly that weren't on the calendar, which is the typical Monday for pastors. But it will make a difference over time to do that practice every day, day in and day out, week in and week out, with respect to physical health, emotional health, et cetera. So small practices done frequently and consistently, where we can take a step back from the flow of busyness and just pause, are really, really important practices. We're finding contemplative kinds of practices, especially from Christian history, seem to be especially important for ministry leaders.
What are some of the distinctions, if there are in the research, on church size? We've part of the reality is a failure in a church of 100 doesn't make the national news. But
right.
I hear one more story that begins with Dallas area pastor. I'm kind of tired of the phrase Dallas area pastor.
Yeah, no kidding.
But I've seen some of these explosions up close. I've seen people just pastors lose their way, and maybe because of the world I live, sometimes that's in the megachurch space. And do you see a distinction by size, or are the mental health issues similar in each place?
The Stetzer Church Leaders Podcast is part of the Church Leaders Podcast Network, which is dedicated to resourcing church leaders in order to help them face the complexities of ministry today. The Church Leaders Podcast Network supports pastors and ministry leaders by challenging assumptions, by providing insights, and offering practical advice and solutions and steps that will help church leaders navigate the variety of cultures and contexts that we're serving in. Learn more at ChurchLeaders.com/podcast network.
Yeah, with what so far, from a research perspective, I think the distinction I would see would be in the nature of the stresses. Some of the stresses, some of them are the same across the board.
Yeah, sure.
And yet, one megachurch pastor I know likes to tell pastors that sort of dream of being a megachurch pastor. So, be careful what you wish for. Bigger church, bigger problems in some ways, and yet what the research seems to tell us is that regardless of the size of church, it only takes 4 to 6 people, if they're networked the right way and are toxic enough in their behavior and subversive of a pastor, to really subvert and destroy a church, regardless of the size.
Oh yeah, no, it's true, and that's kind of, it's interesting your research says that, because that's been an old preacher saying for decades. Is that it's about 5-7 people that will take a pastor down, take a pastor out. Now, sometimes that might be something that needs to be done, but sure. but simultaneously, it does seem to be. And so I guess part of we have an article coming out I'm the editor of a magazine related to this podcast called Outreach Magazine, and Margaret Diddams, well-known, former provost of Wheaton, but psychologist by background. She's writing an article on betrayal trauma and how pastors experience that so consistently. And again, I want to say, if someone's listening right now and they're like, well, what about the bad pastors? Well, okay, there are bad pastors,
Yes.
but what about the good pastors, and how do they stay healthy as well? So talk to us a little bit about some of the unique stresses that cause some of these struggles that pastors have.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. I mean, the flip side of that is what we're finding is that pastors who don't do the hard work of getting to know themselves as a person, cultivating self-awareness, emotional intelligence kinds of competencies, if they don't do that work, they tend not to flourish long-term in ministry, regardless of church size. So there's work that pastors have to do, of course, to be healthy themselves. I think there's some unique stresses, some stresses that pastors have in common with all helping professions, but some of the things that have sort of popped as unique are kind of simultaneous role complexity. There is no more complex job description than being a pastor, according to our research. And the number of hats pastors have to wear, the breadth of competencies and switching rapidly between those in any given day, it just is unlike any other job. And simultaneous role immersion, which is what psychologists refer to when there's a job where you're in it 24/7. It's not just a job, it's a calling, it's an identity. You go to the grocery store at 11 o'clock at night. If you're a pastor and you run into somebody from church, you're hearing a confession or doing pastoral care.
You've got to go into pastor mode. You can even, there's some people call it pastor face. You got to be ready to go. Yep.
Totally. And that's a 24/7 deal. And then there's also role ambiguity in the sense that, what does a pastor do? People think they just work on Sundays, and you've probably got as many opinions of what pastors should be doing as there are people in the pews. And so navigating all of that can be very challenging. And the result of the way people relate to a pastor is paradoxically very isolating. And this is the surprise to people that have never been in ministry, that, how could you possibly be lonely, pastor? You're around people all the time. Well, it's sort of the water everywhere, not a drop to drink kind of phenomenon, because people are relating more to your role than to who you actually are as Ed or Chris as a person. And unless we maintain places where we're truly known and have true two-way intimacy and accountability and all those kinds of things, certainly in a healthy marriage and family if you're married, but I also recommend pastors have at least one close personal friendship outside of their congregation. Why? Because that person doesn't need you to be their pastor. They know you're a pastor, they support that, but you can just be a friend. You can just be a guy or a gal, or, just laugh, vent if you need to vent, cry if you need to cry, be totally spontaneously who you are and not have to be measured and guarded and pastoral in everything that you do. And it just helps to have a place to be able to step out of that and be genuine and be fully known somewhere.
And could that friend, you mentioned that they know you're a pastor, but maybe I'm reading into it that they're not a pastor. Is that good to have pastor friends like that, mutual pastors who can help you relate?
Yeah, we're finding both. That it's the other piece that's really important for clergy is to have a community of practice. Okay. Other people that do what you do, that you can be real with and not be competitive with. And that's the challenge that pastors often have. But people that understand what it's like in your world, and you can encourage one another, share ideas, etc. And so it can be another pastor who's a close friend, but it can also be really helpful, in my experience, when somebody's in a totally different line of work, just to hear what that's like, and it just kind of get you outside of that clergy world a little bit.
I found being I've been a church planner, a pastor of a small church, interim pastor of some churches, and now I guess something of a motivational speaker who lives in the van down by the river. But I have found a commonality, is that people who are not invested in you really will use you as a commodity.
Yes.
And
which is
painful. They're kind of offended when you advocate for yourself in that. So I'll give you just an example. Yep. I get a call pretty frequently. Hey, would you come speak at our 3-day conference? And we'd like you to speak each morning and stay with us for 3 days. And I say to them, well, I could do one day and speak 3 times. And to them, it's like, well, you're too big of a deal. You don't want to come spend time with us. And to me, I'm married and I've got this, well, in this case, I got a job and even in church life, when church was, when it started having activities, church I planted grew to 125 or so. I wrote my DMin dissertation on this back in the long time ago for the PhD. And it was, but we need the pastor at this and we need a pastor at this. Yes. I was the center of the wheel. The spokes all came to me as the hub. And when you try to undo that, well, listen, I'm probably not going to come to the women's event or the men's event. Well, let's have some. It's like, well, what do you not love us?
Right.
And so I really had to. I'm very comfortable in this space now, but I was not comfortable in this space 20 years ago, and it led to some real distress in my life.
Absolutely.
Leading to the point where I was like, what am I doing? So there is that sense. So how do you advise pastors to advocate? And again, we're doing this. The Stetzer Church Leaders Podcast is not just pastors; it's pastors and church leaders. And the Flourishing in Ministry initiative is pastors and church leaders.
Yes.
So how can he or she advocate for better balance when people are offended by the very thing that the pastor or the church leader needs?
Well, and this also ties back to something you mentioned earlier I wanted to highlight, which is that there is a form or forms of post-traumatic stress that I think pastors experience that's more relational trauma. When you really invest in folks and you're there for them in crisis and you're there to marry them in funerals and in the hospital and whatever, only to find out that they're really relating to you as a commodity. And that's very painful, for understandably. And so one of the things that we talk with folks about in the Flourishing Ministry training is developing assertiveness skills. Most of us tend to be more passive who go into ministry leadership. We're just nice people. We do this because we love people, and possibly to the point of even being a little bit conflict avoidant. And so we're also not talking about being overly aggressive, like I coined the term sociopastor instead of sociopath. It's a little term I came up with.
I did not know you coined that term.
So there's an extreme version of a bully type of aggressive pastor. We're not talking about that, but there's a middle place of healthy boundaries of being able to say what I need and think and want and feel in a way that's not overbearing or manipulative or coercive, but is also clear. And there are times people are going to be disappointed. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Ron Heifetz, psychiatrist, but he defines leadership as disappointing people at a rate they can tolerate. And sometimes
that's actually one of my talks when I teach leadership at Talbot.
Oh, fantastic! For pastors, I think that's always the decision you're weighing in your mind. Is that it's not just these aren't just time management decisions. These all have relational consequences, and I can't be everywhere and meet everybody's expectations. So what are sort of reasonable and fair expectations, and how do we have conversation about that as church leadership? And often when pastors can kind of come to terms with having fair and reasonable expectations of themselves, it makes it much easier to navigate all the other expectations that people have for you. It's still challenging because it can lead to conflict and so forth, as you're well aware. But
if you're going to survive, you're going to have those conversations, and you're going to have to
develop assertiveness and conflict management.
Right, you can do it graciously and lovingly. When I explained this, folks who wanted me to come for 3 days, and I said it's not that I wouldn't want to say I'll be there all day. I can have lunch with everybody, breakfast with everybody, dinner with everybody, but I can't take 3 days away.
Yeah.
And they understood, but I had to explain it because there's we're speakers, there's kind of a perception of that. But it's also with pastors, like, you're too important to come do this. Well, no, there's a space and place for pacing those things. And good elders and leadership teams are so essential to that.
Yeah. I've been hurt that you didn't hang out with me after breakfast. So, I'm working through that.
I did leave. I actually showed up late and left early, which was not my intent. I had a traffic problem. One of the things that living in LA or driving in LA County, you always traffic. Anyway, it is what it is. It was a good meeting and you did a great job. So what is one of the things I tell pastors, one way to measure kind of where you are on a healthy relationship with your congregation is when you get a text saying, "Pastor, can we get together to talk?" how strong is your reaction, and
Right.
what direction does that reaction go? Now, it used to be back when the phone call, it's like, and I got to tell you, this is from experience. So 20 years ago, we were pastoring, I was planting a church was growing, but every week I had this psychological need to have more people every week, like literally every week. So I'd call people on Saturday, make sure you bring your family this weekend. But then when I got that call back, I was too vested in this.
Yes.
So help the pastors and church leaders. What's you get that text. There's a normal sense of, I don't think that's a bad thing to say, because otherwise they say, I want to get together and talk about our youth ministry or something of that sort. But then at the same time, it's dread.
Yes.
There's something more. So what are some ways to sort of measure whether you're maybe off where you need to be?
Such a great question. What that leads me to think about is one of the tasks I think in ministry is managing our adrenaline. So let me unpack that for just a second.
Please, I like that.
That it's a very adrenaline demanding profession. And this is what's often off the radar for ministry leaders, that we're constantly overtaxing our own stress hormones just to meet the demands of the job. And if we're not careful, we can start sort of reacting to everything indiscriminately as if everything's a crisis, because other people may think it's a crisis, and it's easy to take on other people's anxiety. Anxiety is sort of contagious in that way. And so to think through for ourselves, this is the way I define an actual crisis versus what someone might feel like is a crisis. I heard a really interesting sermon not too long ago from a denominational leader who was unpacking the Call of Moses story, the burning bush story. And I hadn't heard this before, and I went and looked it up afterward to make sure he wasn't just making this up or something. And apparently the kind of bush that Moses saw burning in the desert, still to this day in that part of the world, if it gets hot enough in the desert, will spontaneously combust. And so maybe it wasn't unusual that Moses saw that kind of bush on fire. What was unusual is that it wasn't being consumed and it was speaking to him. And so the task of ministry then is to learn which fires to pay attention to. And I really like that because we can learn to respond rather than react. Part of what I would say about getting the text is, well, let's think about who should have your cell phone number and who shouldn't in the first place. And do you want everybody texting you? That's something to think through intentionally. What are the mechanisms and ways people get access to you in the pastoral staff, and have some way of having a process for that? Because the unhealthier people are in their own emotional development, the more they're going to push those boundaries. They're going to call you at 2 a.m. They're going to come by the parsonage unannounced, come by the office unannounced. And sometimes we need to help people learn how to have healthier boundaries. And people were going to protest that at times. In fact, I was talking recently with a friend of mine, Ed, who went through a really severe burnout experience in ministry, and he got into therapy and got a leadership coach and recovered and has been back in ministry for a long time. But he said, what I wasn't prepared for after I got healthier was the people that really liked the former unhealthy me with no boundaries.
Oh, how fascinating.
And I came back healthier, and people were upset about that. And some people even left the church because they liked me over functioning, not having the healthy boundaries. And of course we want to be responsive. I mean, that's a pastor's heart, and you're there for people when the tragedy does happen at 2 a.m. I mean, sometimes that's what we do. And yet there has to be some pace and some limits and boundaries around that if we're going to do this sustainably.
The ministry Dr. Chris Adams has is called Flourishing in Ministry. It's flourishingministry.org, and you can find more information there. Last word from you. A 30-something minute podcast is not going to change everybody's life. With Chris Adams on, perhaps it will. But what sure, would you kind of give one parting word of advice to the pastors and church leaders who listen related to their own flourishing in ministry?
Oh, great. I think one of the things I would give is something that we've learned that I've had many, many pastors say to me was a game changer for them when they implemented this practice, which is you need to play. What we're finding is for at least 30 minutes a week as a bare minimum, do something that meets these 3 criteria. that you love doing just for the sheer enjoyment of the activity. You can literally just lose yourself in it like a child at play, and it evokes all kinds of fun and positive emotions. And that you have some skill in doing. It can be developing skill, and that takes your full concentration to do it. Now, that's the key. Why is that important? Because when we do something like that, we're not also mentally working when we're taking our Sabbath day or our day off or resting. For pastors that preach regularly, I always ask them, when's the sermon done being prepared? And the answer is when I'm done preaching it. It's always germinating back there somewhere. And unless we're intentional, we never take a mental break from ministry. And so when we're mentally working, even, it's stirring up all those stress hormones and stress physiology. And during a time when we're supposed to be doing something where God can renew us, replenish us, recreate us. So it's important to play. And what we know is that you come back to the same work with exponentially higher productivity, efficiency, creativity than if you hadn't taken a break and gone and done something renewing. So that'd be the biggest thing I would want to leave your listeners with.
We've been talking to Dr. Chris Adams. Be sure to check out the Flourishing in Ministry project at flourishinginministry.org. Thanks again for listening to the Stetzer Church Leaders Podcast. You can find more interviews as well as other great content for ministry leaders at ChurchLeaders.com/podcast. And again, if you found a conversation today helpful, we'd love for you to take a few moments to leave us a review, give us a like and a follow, and that'll help other ministry leaders find us and benefit from our content. Thanks for listening. We'll see you in the next episode.
You've been listening to the Stetzer Church Leaders Podcast. For more great interviews, as well as articles, videos, and free resources, visit our website at ChurchLeaders.com. Thanks for listening.